All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're here to launch a brand new report from the team here at the International Institute for Strategic Studies on mitigating the risks of an unconstrained Iranian nuclear program. You can see the names by way of introduction. My name is William Alberque. I'm the Director of Strategy, Technology, and Arms Control. I'm very grateful to be joined by our incredible brain trust on Middle Eastern issues, without whom I simply would not have been able to contribute anything useful here. So at the far side of the table, Emile Hokayem, he's the Director for Regional Studies and Senior Fellow in the Middle East Office, and next to him, Dr. Hasan Alhasan, another one of our excellent fellows, and Amnah Ibraheem, also from the office that IISS has in Manama, Bahrain. I sit in the IISS office, the relatively newcomer to the game in Europe, in Berlin. Very well-timed office there, looking at strategic issues as well as nuclear deterrence issues, which is something that I've been working on for some decades, having worked at NATO and the Pentagon before this. This particular work is funded by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office to explore, to investigate the options and tools to mitigate the threat of an unconstrained Iranian nuclear program in conjunction with the Gulf Cooperation Council states, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And it was originally my thought that this report would look at what are the different resting points, what are the different equilibrium points for Iran in between where they were when we started this project and full nuclear weaponization. So short of nuclear weaponization, where is Iran likely to rest? And then what are the deterrence options and diplomatic options you could use to push them towards a stable equilibrium point? With the thought that the worst case scenario here is a regional war, to be blunt, a regional war that would have instant global consequences for the global economy, but also massive loss of life in the region and the potential for a conflict to go much, much wider. Due to involvement of the United States, of the UK, France, Russia, China, the 5 traditional nuclear weapon states directly involved in the region. But instead, because of the excellent work that the Middle East Office team did, what we found out was that there was a much more interesting story to be told here. As to what the equilibrium point, we can guess, we can say all kinds of things. Okay, a stockpile of 60% rich uranium, 84.7%, some metallurgization, development of a nuclear pit, construction of an entire nuclear warhead. And then will Iran be like South Africa, 6 bombs in the basement? Or will they be like North Korea, where they do full testing? We're not really going to be able to control that. And quite frankly, that question became relatively uninteresting in this conversation. What became much more interesting is the regional dynamics. And if you look at this area very carefully, you will already know this, but for those of us who look at the region from a different angle, I come at this from nuclear weapons, from war. I'm not looking at the nuances of diplomacy. And really the team found out that there's fascinating regional dynamics that are underway that could provide an opening for very interesting engagement by the UK and other Western powers in order to head off the worst case scenario and encourage a better case scenario. And in fact, the report comes out with 10 critical findings that I think are really fascinating. I'll let Amnah and Hasan tell you more about those. But for the states in the region, the big takeaway in all of our conversations, now keep in mind, this is a project where we had workshops and we had interviews with decision makers in the governments. We're not talking to think tanks. We're not wondering, we're going directly to them and asking them. We're having off-the-record meetings. We're having Chatham House rule workshops so that they can really be honest with us. And the thing that we heard over and over again is, as far as we're concerned, Iran is already weaponizing, and we must reorganize, reorient, rethink it is to them relatively irrelevant, except insofar as whether or not the US and Israel take direct action, but they must rearrange their security arrangements accordingly. And I thought that was really fascinating. We'll hear more about that. But we also looked at, okay, so what are the three likely outcomes, and then how do we engage with the states in the region positively? And of course, the worst case, regional war. The second worst case would be instability but no nuclear breakout. And the best case would be some sort of deal that keeps us moving along, that keeps us short of war, that buys us time to do whatever it is we're going to do diplomatically to resolve the situation. And also from the region, again and again, we heard the preference for three tools to be used in this case: deterrence, containment, and engagement. It's sort of a very classical model. And you see in the region, different states have put different weights on those three. And I think those are going to need to level up a little bit more, or they're going to need to have real agreement in the region as to who's doing what, rather than to surprise each other and undermine each other. But we'll see about all of that. So the question then is, does the West, does the UK in particular, as one who's funded us and encouraged us in this work, have the appetite to engage? Does anyone really have the appetite? And that's a real question. And I heard at one point a colleague, I won't name, asked, should the UK follow the model of the Iraq War, where they're all in, or should they follow the model of the Vietnam War, where this is the US's problem and they contribute, they feel like, which was just an absolutely fascinating question to ask, because this will take patience in order to have a good outcome. It will take political will, it will take strategy. And that's what we wanted to do, is to lay out some bedrock on how one could build a strategy, engage in the region, empower the countries in the region, engage with them. And if you have a real strategy, and if you have an idea of how to bring them all along, because as you may know, in some of these dialogues, the countries in the region feel left out, they feel sidelined. It'd be really interesting to see how a good strategy could engage the region, empower them, and have a longer-term stable outcome. Well, in the meantime, we try to think of the real issue here. What do we do about Iran? My point has always been, with something like the JCPOA, with arms control, one of the core purposes in arms control is to prevent unintentional conflict or ruinous arms races. But essentially, it's buying you time to resolve the underlying conflict. And otherwise, we're just playing whack-a-mole on issues. It's nuclear today, missiles tomorrow, aircraft the next day, chemical or biological weapons. The conundrum is still, how do we handle Iran in the longer term? And frankly, I think if we're listening to the states in the region and developing a strategy based on regional preferences, then we're more likely to have a stable outcome that can get at the core of the issue with Oman. So with that little choreography, I'm going to turn to Amnah Hasan to talk to you about those findings that we have. Then I'm going to turn to Emile for his usual excellent insights, talk a little bit more about the military and nuclear angle, and then open up for questions. So I'm going to turn to my two wonderful colleagues. Amnah, do you want to lead?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to cover some of the findings in terms of the intra-GCC dynamics that were revealed to us through our study. The very interesting finding was that they all seemed to, even though there is no unified strategic plan amongst the GCC in dealing with Iran, and I will say that first, that they all have some level of coordination when it comes to their economic, military, diplomatic engagements, but there is no unified strategic plan that they've all sat around the table and devised when it comes to this issue. At the same time, they all do agree, and it really did seem so, that there needs to be some level of engagement at this point. At the time that we started the study, tensions were really high. We could see that there was not going to be a JCPOA 0.2. We could see it falling apart right in front of us. And the Gulf states were watching this all unfold as well. And at the same time, watching regional stability aspects not be resolved. So they no longer had even a nuclear deal on one end, and they didn't have a solution to the regional stability issue. There was also the American tilt towards Asia, the UK's tilt towards Asia. And it seemed like it was time to work on this amongst themselves with Iran. So this does not mean that they all agree. So the perception of threat does differ, even though even states like Oman, Qatar, that are obviously seemed more willing to engage with Iran. I mean, Oman has had maritime security exercises with Iran. They seem close from a economic point of view as well with Qatar. They still all agree on the threats. It's because of the threats that they engage. The threat for the nuclear program, what that holds for destabilizing the region, the threat of the proxy networks and what they're capable of when activated in the region, and domestic cells. Kuwait has had diplomatic relations with Iran for decades, but then shut them down when Aramco was attacked, but also when there were domestic cells in Kuwait that were sponsored by Iranian networks. So that domestic perception of threat from Iran exists in all of these states, even though they have differences in their response appetite. So, to get into it, with the UAE, Qatar, Oman to some level, in even Kuwait, there is this perception of using economic engagement with Iran to appease it or to keep it at bay from being hostile. Especially with the UAE recently, there's a very active incentive to build leverage with Iran through an economic portfolio, invest billions of dollars so that you can then use this as containment as well later on. You have economic leverage over Iran, given all the sanctions they're facing. And in the future, you can say, do you want us to pull our investments? Is this, it becomes a tool of economic leverage for the UAE. Now, whether or not this works and how this works, we didn't see this work very well with the EU when they tried this, as part of the JCPOA, to build economic leverage in the future with Iran, invest in Iran. And that didn't help keep the EU involved, to keep Iran involved with its commitments to JCPOA when the US left. But the relationship between Iran and its neighbors is different. And so, we'll have to wait and see if the UAE can actually, continue building this leverage with Iran. Closeness with Iran because of the blockade. But other states that are kind of more interesting to us, like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, even the UAE actually, in the security element of this, are more hawkish when it comes to Iran on the kind of security deterrence level, attempting to build up their militaries. Kuwait's doubling the size of its naval forces with its plane purchases recently. Saudi Arabia obviously continues to do that. The UAE continues to do that. There's still going to be a high priority on what can be done in terms of closing that military gap that seems to exist between Iran and some of the states in the Gulf. At the same time, diplomatically, even though Kuwait closed the embassy, they were continuing to back channel with Iran the whole time, continuing to have those conversations, reopened the embassy between the two states, when the Emirates also opened the embassies between the two states. And so really the test is, the hard case, which is Bahrain. Bahrain is probably the most threatened state, given its, the meddling that Iran has had in the country, and is the least likely to lead on any Iranian engagements. We'll have to wait to see what Saudi Arabia does. When Saudi Arabia decides to lift its engagement to a higher level than merely the diplomatic highest level there, and see if economic engagement can happen, see to what extent it happens, see what happens in the security aspect in Yemen, if that continues to stay quiet. That will kind of tell us the temperature of where Bahrain will probably follow. How long the appeasement lasts, or the low tensions, however you want to, whatever term you want to use for now. We really don't know what to see right now. This is all just happening, but this is according to our conversations in the region at the time. There also is the idea of where to go in terms of building cooperation in the region moving forward. The GCC seems to have a bigger role, or planning to have a bigger role. we've seen this also happen with the Arab League and in the Arab summits, where there's much more kind of the second rise of a Arab cooperation on the diplomatic level is happening. There's this aspect between the GCC states to show that we can coordinate. We are constantly coordinating. We will coordinate even with countries like Qatar, with countries like Oman that are very close to Iran, and we'll coordinate with Iran directly on the regional aspect. Now, whether or not this translates into nuclear changes and I'm a nuclear policy specialist, so I do want to address this issue, is highly unlikely because this was never the Iranian desire, right? Iran has from the very beginning, from the early first JCPOA talks, made it very clear that their nuclear program will remain separate from their regional security behavior, and that those two files are not going to overlap for them. It's because they have two different audiences, right? One is Israel and the US when it comes to their nuclear program, and a little bit of Europe, but the regional stability aspect is one in its own neighborhood. And Iran, I'll let Emile and Hasan talk more about this, but, wants to show that it can handle its affairs in its own neighborhood. So I don't know whether or not there will be any room for even negotiations on that when it comes to the GCC states. But at the same time, the GCC states are now building their own nuclear capabilities through peaceful nuclear energy. Yes, the Emirates waived its right to enrichment, but that's a great nuclear diplomacy strategy. The better you look as a good actor in nuclear technology, the worse Iran looks as a bad actor in nuclear technology. Even Saudi Arabia's latest announcements of wanting to develop a fuel cycle, wanting to develop enrichment capabilities, those are all purposed on a credible, technical, international supplier markets. So they plan to do this, in the, international fuel cycle world, which would be a legitimate avenue rather than, secret dealings or whatever that we, we really haven't seen even satellite imagery, real signs of or anything. So they are building their capabilities. What happens between the UAE and Saudi Arabia in the future, given the gold standard that UAE has signed on to, it's going to be scientific exchange, capability development, which takes a very long time, especially for a state that has such an ambitious nuclear portfolio like Saudi Arabia. They want to build 13 reactors. They want to deploy SMRs. They've signed agreements with South Korea and China on some level, but also some European states when it comes to their regulatory authorities. They have two regulatory authorities instead of just one. So it's a very, very ambitious plan that Saudi Arabia has, which requires a lot of time. And that kind of capabilities development needs to happen for Saudi Arabia, which is an outward facing country, right? This is not Iran looking to build only indigenous capabilities for solely security reasons. They have ambitious development plans that are tethered to the international investment system. So they're not going to risk losing all of these relationships, their security partnerships with the US. They're just buying time for now by developing the capabilities and then seeing what happens with the US and Iran on the Iranian nuclear file. And I'll, let you guys pick up the rest.
Great, thank you very much. We turn to Hasan now, but just a reminder to our audience, thank you all for logging in. I've got two great questions that we will address a little bit later, so feel free to use the Q&A function to add in some more great thoughts. And with that, Hasan, please.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm gonna, I think, perhaps walk us through some of the regional and intra-GCC convergences and divergences on how they view Iran and how they approach Iran, and what emphasis they place on, containment versus engagement versus deterrence, or and so on and so forth, with some preferring to engage economically and build economic leverage with Iran, while others perhaps take a more hawkish posture and so on. What I'll do in the next few minutes is focus on where some of the main external powers fit into the GCC states' strategic calculus or calculi, because there are multiple calculi, and exactly what the wager is on, and how these relationships with the US, China, Russia, and Israel fit into the broader approaches of the various GCC states vis-a-vis Iran. So I think, let's start with the big and obvious one, which is the United States. And that's very interesting because the US GCC relationship has been the subject of a lot of attention. It always seems to be headed, in a worse direction. Most of the recent news and media coverage is all about how, they're essentially going their separate ways. That might be true in the very grand scheme of things. But I think at the moment, I would still say that the Gulf states are still wagering on their relationship with the US as essentially the best, or at the very least, the least problematic, the least bad option for being able to deter and contain and really just to deal with the perceived Iranian threat. And I think this applies across the board for all the GCC states, because there is a massive gap, not in military capabilities, because there are some areas where the GCC states are more capable, for example, in terms of maintaining air superiority and so on. But it's really in the asymmetry of pain. How much pain they can inflict on each other and how much pain they are able to endure. So it's really the asymmetry of pain. Iran is able to inflict a lot more pain on the GCC states than the opposite. And Iran is able to endure a lot more pain than the GCC states can. And so I think, this is the asymmetry fundamentally that characterizes the relationship in my personal analysis, and is what essentially drives GCC thinking on the importance of the strategic relationship with the US. The difficulty, I think, in dealing with the US is obviously the US is the senior, more powerful partner in this relationship. It sets the tone for the most part. Of course, the GCC states are able to exercise a lot of agency, including in terms of playing the domestic politics of the US. We've seen that during the days of the Trump administration very clearly. But by and large, I think the Gulf states have been extremely worried by what they perceive to be massive US policy volatility on Iran, with US approach or strategy or policy on Iran ranging from a potential grand bargain under President Obama, predicated on a sort of a JCPOA plus, to maximum pressure under President Trump, and then to a more sort of limited arms control approach under the Biden administration, right? So massive policy volatility, very problematic in trying to deal with a persistent threat that's just next door. And so the point is, I think ultimately, what the Gulf states are actually pushing for is not a weaker or less US presence in the region. If anything, it's the opposite. They want a more codified, a more formal security relationship with the US. I mean, the Emiratis have been publicly saying this. Anwar Gargash has been publicly talking about the notion that the US, if anything, should conclude a treaty-like, preferably alliance with the Gulf states. Probably never going to happen. Or at the very least, make a very formal and codified security commitment to the region. And so I think a lot of the GCC posturing is, in a sense, trying to change the incentive structure for the US to be more engaged by saying that, if the US doesn't engage, then we will bring in China to, do diplomatic facilitation with Iran. We will potentially look at, building a civil nuclear program, with the implicit sort of understanding that in the very long term, this could potentially serve as a hedge against the nuclear Iran, right? And so in a sense, I think a lot of this is creating an incentive structure that makes greater US involvement, for example, to prevent a proliferation cascade, than the opposite. So I think it's still strategic alignment. There's a desire for strategic alignment with a lot of tactical opportunism, right? So tactically, they're very opportunistic, but if anything, they would like to see more US, if only because developing a credible nuclear hedge is going to be extremely expensive in every sense, and very difficult and time-consuming. Coordinating among the GCC states for a more unified defense and security policy is extremely difficult, and it hasn't really happened to any significant degree over the past 40 years of the GCC's existence. And so really the best bet still is to be able to have this strong US presence in the region that can coordinate among the different GCC states and present a unified response to Iran. On Israel, it's interesting because I think there's a lot of disagreement between the GCC states on the utility of cultivating Israel as a potential member of a regional, not alliance, but at least a regional coalition against Iran. Some see Israel as being more of a burden, as a strategic liability than a strategic asset, because of the potential of Israeli unilateral escalatory action against Iran, which could create an entanglement risk for the Gulf states. So the Gulf states that are seen as being aligned with Israel will more likely be in the Iranian firing line. This is some of the GCC sort of concern. And so in a sense, the strategic return on the Abraham Accord, to my mind, is not yet very clear. It's not yet very clear that the UAE and Bahrain, for example, are reaping strategic dividends. The Israelis, to my understanding, I'm not an Israel expert, but from what I understand, are tying greater security, defense industrial cooperation with the UAE and Bahrain, with the Abraham Accord partners, to a more public and unconditional display of the relationship with Israel, which is going to be very difficult given the present political climate in Israel and very problematic direction that Israel's own internal politics and relationship with the Palestinians is taking. And so the politics of the Israeli Palestinian issue are going to make it more difficult for the UAE and Bahrain and others to display a more public and unconditional relationship with Israel. But I think it seems that at the very least, there is still a lot of disagreement among the GCC states as to whether would we be playing into Iran's hands, strengthening Iran's narrative, if we were to normalize with Israel without there being a corresponding, substantive improvement in, the Palestinian situation, or clear progress towards a two-state solution or whatever. So Israel is a matter of disagreement. 3, on Russia. It's interesting because I think at some point there was a GCC wager that if Russia were to become severely weakened because of European and American sanctions, it would grow more desperate and more dependent on Iran, and would therefore be more likely to cater to Iran and to become more complacent with Iran's agenda in the Middle East. So the idea is that, yes, you can weaken Russia, but you can't completely write it off as a player. And the idea that Russia can still, alter to some extent the strategic equation in the Gulf by transferring, Sukhoi 35s to Iran or advanced air defense systems and so on, and essentially erode the GCC states' conventional superiority, at least as far as the air domain is concerned. So the idea is that Russia could be a problematic element in the Gulf strategic equation. They could still empower Iran quite significantly. And so I think there was a wager at some point that if the Gulf states played a little bit nicer with Russia in the present juncture, that they could help moderate Russia's behavior vis-a-vis Iran. I think, we'll see. The Iranians seem to be saying that the transfer of the Su-35s is imminent. We're watching this very closely. If that happens, then I think this will probably, and I think the Gulf states are already recalibrating their positions and shifting a bit closer to the EU and to the Americans on the Russia-Ukraine war. I think if the Russians do make those transfers, then the idea that you could moderate Russian behavior by engaging it a bit more closely with Russia is going to be discredited. And then we're likely to see a readjustment in GCC foreign policy. The final one on China is very interesting because Iran traditionally has not been a topic on which the GCC states have engaged China, seriously and systematically. The Chinese have almost sort of always defaulted to the Russian position. They've almost always backed the Russian security proposals for what Gulf regional security should look like. It makes rational sense, I think, for the Saudis to seek a Chinese role in the diplomatic de-escalation with Iran, because China is pretty much the only actor that has, significant leverage on Iran at this stage. So it's not irrational for the Saudis to seek a Chinese role. The Americans wouldn't do it anyway, because the Americans are essentially more in the mindset of piling diplomatic pressure on Iran to get them to budge on the nuclear track of things. And so there is a misalignment here, I think, between the GCC states and the US. With China, I think from the Chinese perspective, it's a quick win they can sponsor this and put their stamp on it and look good. I think there's going to be a mismatch in expectations. The Saudis will expect the Chinese to do something to try and enforce Iranian compliance with whatever commitments were arrived at. We might be seeing some of the consequences of the Saudi-Iran agreement with Syria's readmission into the Arab League. This is something that maybe Emile will talk about a little bit more. But I think the point is that China's role is still very limited. It will be interesting to see whether the Chinese will come in and will invest diplomatic capital in ensuring compliance. And do the Chinese see an interest for them in making sure that the Saudi-Iranian agreement succeeds? That is yet to see. But I don't think this is signaling, in any case, a strategic shift in China's posture in the Middle East. At least not yet.
Emile, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So the big question right now is, what does the ongoing regional de-escalation mean for the future of nuclear diplomacy with Iran? Will the series of agreements and arrangements and hugs and grinning handshakes and so on facilitate or perhaps complicate further nuclear diplomacy? There is an idea that's emerging in Western capitals that, that's great actually. And perhaps, the approach of, the JPOA and then the JCPOA was wrong-headed. That, having the global powers lead this and deliver an agreement was perhaps not, the only way that this could have been done. Perhaps regional powers can take ownership of that, incentivize since they're locked in, and especially at that moment where you have, China with this big diplomatic achievement over the Iran-Saudi agreement, and then a Russian diplomatic achievement in terms of bringing back Syria into the Arab League, with Saudi and Emirati support and so on. So perhaps there is some kind of regional dance that can happen that gets Russian and Chinese support, and the West, because the focus on Ukraine, because they don't necessarily have new ideas, because they perhaps don't want to go all the way in terms of sanctions relief or meeting Iran, will take a step back. Western capitals will say, you know what, if they want to make it work, let them try, and they can figure out, between them, how to create an environment of trust and so on. So it wouldn't look like the JCPOA. A lot would be perhaps unwritten and will follow a complex diplomatic dance. But there is this idea, like, Western countries are facing real constraints, some self-imposed, some because of the geopolitical environment and so on. So if the Middle Easterners have figured out a way to work with the Chinese and Russians to bring this back, well, let them own that. And now, let me give you my assessment of regional de-escalation. Of course, it's welcome news that things are not as tense in the region. But also as analysts, we have to be clear about what is happening and how it's happening. I think the process of de-escalation is unstructured, disorganized, and competitive. When you look at how it's taking place or took place with Turkey, with Iran, with Syria, and with Israel, you can see that actually the regional countries are not working from the same sheet. That essentially there is an attempt to adapt, adjust to a fast-changing global environment and to a very different region. And in a way, the way it's happening, it's not like Abu Dhabi and Riyadh and the others call themselves, figure out a strategy, sit down and say, okay, this is how we're going to proceed, and these are clear deliverables, and based on that we will engage or we will punish and so on. No, I mean it's essentially bilateral and transactional, and I don't think that all of that, while it translates into a quieter region, I don't think it necessarily translates into diplomatic opportunities on the nuclear front. I don't think the actors themselves are interested in having that direct discussion with Iran. The Gulf states, part of their displeasure with the 2015 JCPOA was not it wasn't necessarily the terms of the agreement. Yes, they had questions about the sunset, more than questions about the sunset clauses and so on, but fundamentally, they were concerned about two things: the way it was reached, and second, the fact that it put regional security issues on the side. Right now, they look at it and say, well, on regional security, there are things that we can no longer change. Essentially, the boat has sailed. On Syria, they don't see how to challenge Iran anymore. On Yemen, they pushed as hard as they could, did not play the way they wanted, and it had a heavy strategic, reputational, and political cost on them. Even on Turkey, Saudi and Turkey, or the UAE and Turkey, these were heavyweights and a boxing match who could not just KO the other side, right? So essentially, there is a degree of realism, but that doesn't necessarily translate into clear, coordinated strategies. And people don't want to carry those heavy files, especially on the nuclear front, in of themselves. Some in the West would say, okay, let the region hold. I think in the region, it's like, whoa, we want to calm things down, but we don't want to own that file all by ourselves. And by the way, don't let us alone with it with Russia and China. So let's make sure we have that discussion. I hope that's what the strategic dialogue between Western countries and Gulf countries is about. As I said, nuclear diplomacy is not the priority as far as we pick up. Because essentially, just to clarify something you said earlier on, William, they don't consider Iran a nuclear weapon state, but they consider that Iran is a nuclear capable state at this point, right? And for them, the technicalities that we struggle with and the percentages and the number of kilos and so on, all this is a distraction from the bigger discussion about the balance of power in the region and what sets it. And it turns out that what sets the regional balance of power in the region are the arsenal of missiles and UAVs and the support of militias. And the West, with its approach, did not answer these two. If anything, it exacerbated some of those issues. It was at the Manama Dialogue 6 months ago that Ursula von der Leyen said, yeah, we now understand when you guys used to complain about Iranian drones and so on, what you meant, because now we're facing them on the battlefield in Ukraine. So in a way, they're not trying to answer that question about Iran as a nuclear state. They understand that there is little momentum in Western capitals, no great new ideas and so on. They worry about a scenario where essentially Washington says, you know what, you have regional de-escalation, so let's aim for something quick and easy, a less for less formula between the two, not necessarily a revival of the JCPOA, but we're done with that. And they understand that Russia itself is not going to deploy massive capital right now in pressuring Iran one way or another. Regardless of how good or bad relations are with the Gulf states, today Russia's view on this are determined by something even more existential. So their point in their relationship with Russia is to make sure that Russia doesn't deliver specific capabilities to Iran. It's not about seeking Moscow's joining their side on nuclear diplomacy and pushing a specific one. I think the one big question at the moment in Gulf capitals is the impact of all this on Israeli decision making. I think that's perhaps the biggest unknown out there. Hasan talked about the possible provision of Su-45 aircraft by Russia to Iran. I think a bigger strategic worry on the horizon is the delivery of, if Moscow is able to do that, and it's a massive if, because they have production issues and whether there are other priorities and so on. But if Russia were to provide air defense systems, which would complicate an Israeli military options by a factor of 3, 5, 10, whatever you want. The second point is how all this changes the environment over Syria, where there's suddenly Syria's normalization in the Arab world, and with Russian sponsorship, essentially means that Syria is a no-go place for Israel. So if Israel is operationally constrained, then whether it's directly on Iran or in other theaters where Iran is active, then that could actually shape the prospect of that could shape Israeli decision making, which then has a huge impact on the Gulf states. I mean, for all the talk about the Abraham Accord having aligned the Gulf states, I mean, at least those Bahrain and the UAE with Israeli view, here too you had a strategic disagreement. For Israel, the nuclear issue is the foremost one, and Israel considers it has the tools, military, intelligence, and else to deal with, UAV missiles and militias. And the Gulf states consider that the nuclear issue is not the first one. It could have an adverse impact on them depending on the terms reached by the international community with Iran. But what really mattered are militias and missiles and UAVs. The Gulf states learned that they cannot do much about missiles and UAVs. They suffered significantly from that, Yemen, Iraq, elsewhere. So, you have this disconnect. I think the other disconnect is that Israel is clear in its head that its decision-making will not depend on Gulf preferences or red lines. It will depend on what Israel thinks is good for Israel. The Gulf states understand that their own concerns about their own vulnerabilities, exposure, and so on are not a top priority for Israel. So therefore, you need, after this period of rapprochement, you need to clarify better, what separates the two in terms of risk profile, yeah, that's it. So not a pretty picture. I'm sure there will be plenty of words written about how the region can help get to a nuclear diplomacy. I may end up with lots of eggs on my face over that, but at the moment, my sense is this is not the priority. The Gulf countries understand that this is not within their remit to solve.
And just one thank you very much, Emile. That was really wonderful. And I neglected to say we should have named the report "The Asymmetry of Pain." That's a great title. I just want to mention just a couple of things, then open up for questions. Number one, something that you might not have noticed in terms of military development, the shift of Israel from EUCOM to CENTCOM is significant. U.S. European Command primarily thinks about defensiveness. They think about where things are not aimed. CENTCOM thinks much more about where things are aimed. And so we've seen a change in the tenor of exercises with Israel, which I think sends a significant message. Second, really quick, I was struck by how the nations in the region kept talking about Middle East NATO. Having worked at NATO for 8 years, that made me almost faint, but the desire for a direct security guarantee is real. What influence will the Ukraine war, and particularly the performance of Ukrainian missile defenses, have on perceptions in the region? One thing that I kept raising is if you all agreed to work together on integrated air and missile defense, that could be a real demonstration to Iran of the seriousness with which they see the threat. But also, as Emile mentioned, the Su-35s, if Iran gets S-400s, how will that change everything? And just one last thing I wanted to mention, UN Security Council Resolution 2231 lapses in October. There is a lot of talk that may be the date that Iran starts supplying missiles to Russia. And they have significant missile capabilities and stocks on this. And how will the states in the region see advanced Russian fighters, which have been an Iranian desire for decades, plus better missile defenses, plus missiles going the other way? How much will that change the incentives for action, for alliances, et cetera? Just this is why this is a fascinating point, and I do absolutely take your clarification. Right, the states in the region see Iran as nuclear capable now, not that the decision has been made in principle to build weapons or not build weapons, and that's important. But for them, that's kind of irrelevant. Once Iran reached a certain level, good enough. But I also think, looking at the East Asian case, if you don't take care of the nuclear issue and the regional issue and the missile issue and the non-state actor issue, then everything else will unravel everything that you've done. And so I do think there is a role for regional dialogue, but Emile's absolutely right. That's not going to solve the nuclear issue. I think it's a necessary but not sufficient part.